Listen to me carefully, because there are moments in life when silence says more than 1,000 conversations ever could. You may think someone has forgotten you. You may look at their distance, their coldness, their silence, and assume they moved on. They never cared. Maybe I meant nothing. But what if that is not the whole story? What if the human mind has a way of returning to what the heart tried to bury? What if the memories they pushed away begin appearing when the distractions disappear? What if the conversations they avoided begin playing inside their mind? What if the moments they dismissed suddenly become the very moments they cannot stop remembering? Because you have to understand something powerful. Absence creates space for reflection. When you were there, they could distract themselves. They could focus on work, friends, routines, entertainment, new experiences, anything that kept them from sitting alone with their emotions. Distance can feel like control when you are afraid of intimacy, but eventually the world gets quiet, and when the world gets quiet, the mind speaks. That is when the memory comes back. Not necessarily because they suddenly became a different person overnight, not because you need to sit around waiting for them, but because unresolved emotions have a way of demanding attention. And maybe that is why you are here. Maybe you have been asking yourself, how can someone act like I never mattered when I know what we shared? Let me tell you something. You do not need their immediate reaction to validate the reality of what happened. Your value was never determined by their ability to recognize it. Your worth was never dependent upon their emotional capacity. And your future cannot be placed in the hands of someone who is still trying to understand their own heart. There is a divine principle here. Sometimes God removes something from your life, not because you were unworthy of it, but because He wants you to discover who you are without it. Sometimes the separation is not punishment. Sometimes it is preparation. Sometimes the silence is not rejection. Sometimes it is revelation. You wanted answers, but instead you received distance. You wanted closure, but instead you received silence. You wanted them to explain why they changed, but instead you were forced to learn how to stop needing their explanation to move forward. And that transformation is where your power begins. Because the moment you stop chasing someone else's realization, you start creating your own think about what happens inside an avoidant mind. When emotional closeness becomes uncomfortable, distance can become a coping mechanism. They may convince themselves that leaving is easier. They may tell themselves that they do not need anyone. They may minimize the relationship, focus on flaws, rationalize the separation, or convince themselves that moving forward means never looking backward. But human beings are not machines. You cannot simply delete emotional history because you decided not to talk about it. The mind stores moments. The heart stores meaning. And sometimes the memory waits until you are finally quiet enough to hear it. A song can trigger it. A place can trigger it. A familiar phrase can trigger it. A random evening can trigger it. And suddenly, there you are again, not physically, but emotionally. They remember the way you looked at them. They remember the conversations. They remember the comfort. They remember the moments when they felt understood. They remember the person who believed in them when they were struggling to believe in themselves. And sometimes the hardest thing to face is not that they lost you. It is that they may have lost something they did not understand how valuable it was until it was gone. But hear me, do not build your life around waiting for that realization. That is the trap. Your job is not to stand at the door waiting for somebody to knock. Your job is to build a life so meaningful that whether they return or not, you continue becoming everything you were created to become. You cannot control when someone remembers you. You cannot control when someone becomes emotionally mature. You cannot control whether someone confronts their fears, but you can control what you do with this season. You can turn pain into purpose. You can turn rejection into redirection. You can turn loneliness into self-discovery. You can turn silence into spiritual growth. And you can turn the question, why did they leave, into the more powerful question, who am I becoming because they did? That question changes everything, because perhaps this experience was never meant to destroy you. Perhaps it was meant to awaken you. Perhaps you were becoming too dependent upon someone's attention. Perhaps you had forgotten your own dreams while trying to understand theirs. Perhaps you were measuring your worth through their behavior. Perhaps you were waiting for somebody else to choose you while life was waiting for you to choose yourself. Wake up. There is more life ahead of you. There are goals you have not achieved. There are rooms you have not entered. There are people you have not met. There are gifts inside you that have not yet been developed. There is a version of you that does not beg for love, because that version understands that love should be mutual, courageous, honest, and free. And when you become that person, something changes. You stop asking, how do I make them miss me? You start asking, how do I make my life meaningful? You stop wondering, when will they come back? You start wondering, where am I going? You stop obsessing over whether they are replaying the relationship. You start replaying your own dreams. And that is when you reclaim your power. Maybe one day they do look back. Maybe one day they understand. Maybe one day they recognize that the person they pushed away was not their enemy, not their burden, not someone they could simply erase. Maybe they realize that what they called too much was actually emotional depth. Maybe what they called pressure was actually intimacy. Maybe what they called distance was actually their fear. But whether they realize it tomorrow, next year, or never, your life must continue, because your destiny is bigger than another person's emotional timeline. You were not created to spend your life monitoring somebody else's heart. You were created to live, to grow, to love wisely, to become disciplined, to build, to forgive, to heal, to serve, to rise. And perhaps the greatest divine lesson in all of this is that sometimes God allows people to walk away so that you stop walking away from yourself. Think about that. You were so focused on whether they were forgetting you that you forgot to remember yourself. You were so focused on what they were feeling that you stopped asking what you were becoming. You were so focused on whether they would return that you stopped moving forward. No more. Let them have their journey. Let them face their memories. Let them confront whatever they need to confront. Let them learn whatever life needs to teach them. And you keep going. You wake up with purpose. You take care of your mind. You strengthen your body. You deepen your faith. You develop your talents. You surround yourself with people who respect you. You create goals that excite you. You become emotionally secure enough to love without losing yourself. Because real power is not getting someone to chase you. Real power is no longer needing to chase anyone. Real power is being able to say, I loved you sincerely. I valued what we had. I learned from what happened. I forgive what I can. I release what I cannot control. And I will not abandon myself just because you chose distance. That is strength. And if their mind eventually starts replaying everything, let that be their lesson. If memories return, let them return. If regret appears, let them teach. If they finally understand your value, let them understand. But you do not need to interrupt the work God is doing in you just to see whether they are finally thinking about you. Because the greatest comeback is not when someone who left comes back. The greatest comeback is when you come back to yourself. When you remember who you were before the rejection. When you remember your dreams. When you remember your standards. When you remember your faith, when you remember that your life has meaning beyond one relationship, and then you realize something extraordinary. Maybe they were not the ending. Maybe they were the awakening. Maybe the relationship did not come into your life only to stay forever. Maybe it came to teach you something you desperately needed to learn. Maybe it exposed wounds. Maybe it revealed patterns. Maybe it showed you where you were settling. Maybe it taught you boundaries. Maybe it taught you patience. Maybe it taught you that love without emotional courage cannot sustain intimacy. And maybe now you are being called into something deeper, not revenge, not obsession, not waiting, transformation. So let them remember, let them wonder, let them replay, let them face the silence, but you keep building. Because one day you may look back at this chapter and realize that the person you were begging to remember you was never supposed to be the person who determined your future. You were supposed to remember yourself. And when you do, You will no longer need somebody else's mind to replay your memories because you will be too busy creating memories in a life that finally feels like your own. That is the victory. That is the freedom. That is the lesson. And perhaps that is exactly where your next chapter begins. There is something you need to understand about distance. Distance can interrupt communication, but it cannot automatically erase emotional history. You can stop talking to someone. You can stop checking their messages. You can remove their pictures. You can create physical space. You can tell yourself that you are completely finished with the relationship. But the human mind does not operate like a delete button. What mattered emotionally does not simply disappear because you decided to stop looking at it. Sometimes when a person becomes distant, they believe they are becoming stronger. They think, if I don't feel it, I don't have to deal with it. They convince themselves that silence means healing. They believe that avoiding the memories means they are finally free. But avoidance and healing are not the same thing. You can run from a feeling without resolving it. You can bury a memory without destroying its emotional meaning. You can refuse to discuss something while your mind continues processing it underneath the surface. And this is where distance becomes powerful. When someone is constantly present, there is always something happening. Messages arrive, conversations continue. There are distractions, arguments, routines, plans, and emotional reactions. The mind stays occupied, but when that person suddenly disappears, the noise begins to fade. And in the silence, memories become louder. A particular song can suddenly bring back an entire season of life. A familiar place can remind someone of a conversation they thought they had forgotten. A simple phrase can bring back your voice. A certain time of night can recreate the feeling of being together. Suddenly, what was pushed away begins coming forward. That does not necessarily mean they are ready for a relationship again. It does not automatically mean they will return. But it does mean that emotional experiences can remain psychologically significant even when someone refuses to acknowledge them. And here is the lesson for you. Asterisk, never confuse someone's silence with proof that you meant nothing. Their silence may tell you what they are capable of expressing, but it cannot rewrite what happened. You do not need to chase them into remembering. You do not need to send another message just to remind them of your existence. You do not need to prove that the connection was real. If it was meaningful, it left something behind. But now comes the most important part. Don't make their eventual realization your life's mission, because if you spend every day wondering whether they miss you, you are still allowing them to control your emotional world. Let the distance be distance. Let the silence be silence, and use that same space to hear yourself again. Ask yourself what you want. Ask yourself who you are becoming. Ask yourself what dreams you neglected while trying to understand another person's behavior. Sometimes the greatest gift of separation is that it forces you to return your attention to your own life. You cannot control whether someone remembers you, but you can decide what you do with the memories you carry. You can turn them into wisdom instead of wounds. You can turn the loss into growth. You can turn the unanswered questions into self-respect. And you can walk forward knowing that what is truly meant for you will never require you to abandon yourself just to keep it. So let them have their silence. Let their mind process whatever it needs to process. And you keep becoming stronger, wiser, calmer, and more purposeful, because eventually the goal is not to become unforgettable to someone else. The goal is to become so deeply connected to yourself that you no longer need someone else's memory of you to prove that you mattered. There are some things the mind refuses to leave behind because the heart never received the resolution it needed. You can walk away from a relationship, stop having conversations, and create miles of distance. But unresolved emotions can continue living quietly beneath the surface. And when the distractions disappear, those emotions often begin asking for attention again. That is why someone can appear completely unaffected on the outside while internally replaying moments they never properly processed. Maybe there was a conversation that ended too suddenly. Maybe there were words that were never spoken. Maybe there was an apology that never came. Maybe someone walked away believing they were protecting themselves, only to discover later that the distance did not eliminate the questions. The mind searches for completion. When something emotionally significant has no clear ending, the brain naturally revisits it. It asks, what happened? Could I have done something differently? Why did I react that way? What were they really trying to tell me? Did I make the right decision? And those questions can become louder with time. This is why you should never assume that because someone looks calm, they have no emotions. Human beings are incredibly skilled at appearing fine while carrying an internal world nobody else can see. Someone can laugh with friends and still think about you later. Someone can stay busy all day and remember you at night. Someone can convince themselves that leaving was the right decision and still have moments where memories challenge that conclusion. But understand this clearly. You should never build your hope around another person's internal struggle. Their confusion is not your responsibility. Their healing is not your assignment. Their realization is not your purpose. Your responsibility is to heal what is unresolved inside you, because there is another side to this principle. Sometimes you are not only waiting for them to resolve something, you are waiting for yourself to resolve something too. Maybe you are waiting for an explanation. Maybe you are waiting for an apology. Maybe you are waiting for them to admit they were wrong. Maybe you are waiting for them to finally say, you mattered. But what if you stopped waiting? What if you gave yourself the closure you were hoping another person would provide? You can acknowledge that the relationship mattered without requiring it to continue. You can accept that you loved someone without needing them to love you in the same way. You can recognize that something beautiful existed without pretending it was perfect. And you can honor the memories without allowing them to become chains. There is wisdom in understanding that every unfinished chapter does not require another conversation. Sometimes the lesson becomes the closure. Sometimes God does not give you the explanation you wanted because He wants to teach you how to trust without having every answer. You may never know exactly what happened inside another person's heart. You may never know whether they replay your conversations. You may never know whether they regret walking away, but you can know this: your future does not require their confession. Do not spend your life standing at the door of yesterday, waiting for someone to return with answers. Walk forward, build your life, become emotionally stronger, and if their mind eventually replays everything, let that be their journey. Your journey is different. Your journey is learning how to stop needing another person to resolve what you can resolve within yourself. Because real freedom begins when you no longer need someone else to give you permission to move forward. You can forgive without receiving an apology. You can release without receiving an explanation. You can love without chasing. And you can remember without returning. That is emotional maturity. That is strength. And that is how you turn an unresolved chapter into wisdom instead of allowing it to become a prison. There is something powerful that happens when your presence becomes your absence. When someone has constant access to you, they can become accustomed to what you provide. Your messages become normal. Your encouragement becomes expected. Your attention becomes familiar. Your presence can become part of the rhythm of their life without them fully realizing its value. But when that presence disappears, the rhythm changes. Suddenly, there is an empty space where your presence used to be. And sometimes it is only when the noise stops that someone begins to recognize what they were receiving. Maybe they did not appreciate the conversations while they were happening. Maybe they took your patience for granted. Maybe they assumed you would always be there whenever they needed comfort, reassurance, understanding, or connection. Then one day, you stop chasing, you stop explaining, you stop reaching. You stop trying to convince someone to recognize your value. And something changes, not because you are playing a game, not because you are trying to manipulate their emotions, but because you have finally decided that your energy deserves direction. When you stop constantly filling the emotional space, the other person may suddenly become aware of the silence. They may remember the little things. The way you asked how their day was, the way you noticed when something was wrong, the way you encouraged them when they doubted themselves, the way you made ordinary moments feel meaningful. And this is where absence can become a mirror. Your absence does not magically create value. It simply removes the distractions that may have prevented someone from noticing the value that was already there. But listen carefully. Do not disappear just to make someone miss you. That is still making your life revolve around their reaction. Disappear from the chase because you have something more important to pursue. Disappear from begging because you deserve mutual effort. Disappear from emotional confusion because peace is more valuable than temporary attention. There is a difference between creating absence as manipulation and accepting distance as self-respect. One is a strategy, the other is growth. And sometimes when you stop pursuing someone, you discover something even more important than whether they miss you. You discover how much of yourself you were sacrificing just to maintain the connection. Maybe you were constantly checking your phone. Maybe you were analyzing every message. Maybe you were changing yourself to avoid triggering their withdrawal. Maybe you were accepting less than you deserved because you were afraid that asking for more would make them leave. But eventually, you realize that love should not require you to become smaller. You realize that connection should not require you to constantly prove your worth. And you realize that someone else's emotional distance cannot be allowed to determine your emotional stability. This is where divine wisdom enters. Sometimes God creates space because you were too distracted to hear the lesson. Sometimes the door closes because you were standing in the doorway of something new while refusing to release what was behind you. Sometimes the absence of another person creates the presence of yourself. And that may be the greatest transformation of all. You begin to wake up differently. You stop asking, what are they thinking? You start asking, what am I building? You stop asking, do they miss me? You start asking, am I becoming the person I was created to become? You stop measuring your worth by someone's attention. You start measuring your life by your character, your purpose, your peace, and your progress. And if one day their mind finally understands what your presence meant, that is their realization. Let it belong to them. Your responsibility is not to make them regret losing you. Your responsibility is to make sure you never lose yourself again, because the strongest form of absence is not disappearing from someone's life. It is removing yourself from the cycle of chasing, proving, waiting, and wondering. You become present in your own life again, and when you do, you discover something beautiful. You were never meant to spend your life trying to be unforgettable to someone else. You were meant to become unforgettable to yourself. To remember your worth, to remember your purpose, to remember your dreams, and to walk forward with enough faith to believe that what belongs in your life will meet you with the same courage, clarity, and commitment that you bring to it. There is a difference between being free from emotion and being free from the fear of emotion. Many people confuse the two. They believe that if they can distance themselves, shut down, stay busy, and refuse to talk about what they feel, they have become strong. But real strength is not the ability to feel nothing. Real strength is having the courage to feel deeply without allowing those emotions to control your life. Avoidance can create temporary relief, but temporary relief is not the same as permanent peace. Someone may walk away from a relationship because intimacy became uncomfortable. They may convince themselves that they are better alone. They may become cold, detached, or overly independent. They may tell themselves, I don't need anybody. But sometimes I don't need anybody is not confidence. Sometimes it is fear wearing the mask of independence. Because when you genuinely become emotionally secure, you do not need to run from connection. You can communicate. You can establish boundaries. You can say what you feel. You can admit when something hurts. You can apologize when you are wrong. You can receive love without immediately searching for an exit. That is freedom. Avoidance says, if I don't get close, I can't get hurt. Wisdom says, I can get close while still maintaining healthy boundaries. Avoidance says, I don't feel anything. Healing says, I feel it, I understand it, and I know how to respond. There is a tremendous difference. And sometimes the person who walks away believes they have escaped the emotional discomfort, only to discover that the emotion followed them, because you can change your location without changing your internal patterns. You can leave one relationship and carry the same fears into another. You can meet someone new and still become uncomfortable when intimacy increases. You can create distance from one person and still experience the same emotional conflict with the next. Why? Because the problem was never simply the person. The deeper challenge was what closeness awakened inside you. And this is where transformation begins. You have to become willing to look inward, not with shame, not with self-hatred, but with courage. Ask yourself, what am I afraid of? Why does vulnerability make me uncomfortable? Why do I withdraw when someone gets close? Why do I interpret emotional intimacy as a threat? Those questions can change your life, because sometimes the person you are running from is not another human being. Sometimes you are running from your own unresolved wounds, and divine wisdom teaches us that what we refuse to confront often continues to influence us. You cannot heal what you constantly hide from. You cannot transform a pattern you refuse to acknowledge, and you cannot experience deep peace while constantly fighting your own emotions. So if someone walked away from you, let them walk their journey. Do not chase them into emotional maturity. Do not force them to confront what they are not ready to face. And do not take responsibility for healing wounds that belong to them. Instead, take responsibility for your own growth. Become the person who can love without losing yourself. Become the person who can communicate without manipulation. Become the person who can experience rejection without questioning your worth. Become the person who can be alone without feeling abandoned, because that is real emotional freedom. It is not becoming cold, it is becoming whole. And when you become whole, you no longer need distance to feel powerful. You no longer need silence to feel safe. You no longer need emotional walls to protect your identity. You can stand in love without losing yourself. You can walk away without hatred. You can stay without desperation. You can remember without becoming trapped. That is the kind of strength that changes generations. So never mistake someone's avoidance for proof that they are stronger than you. And never mistake your own sensitivity for weakness. Sometimes the person willing to feel, reflect, heal, forgive, and grow is the strongest person in the room, because courage is not the absence of fear. Courage is choosing growth, even when fear tells you to run. And perhaps that is the lesson this entire experience came to teach you. You do not become powerful by feeling less. You become powerful by becoming wise enough to understand what you feel, disciplined enough to choose your response, and courageous enough to keep moving toward the life you were meant to live. Sometimes the most powerful answers in life do not come through words. They come through silence. There are seasons when God allows the noise to disappear because there are truths you could not hear while everything around you was loud. A relationship can be filled with conversations, emotions, expectations, arguments, affection, and uncertainty. And when it suddenly becomes quiet, that silence can feel painful. But silence is not always empty. Sometimes silence is where revelation begins. When someone walks away, you may immediately ask, why did this happen? You want an explanation. You want them to tell you what changed. You want to know whether they ever cared, whether they miss you, whether they regret leaving, or whether they are thinking about everything that happened. But sometimes the answer you are searching for from another person is the answer you are being invited to discover within yourself. Maybe God is using this separation to reveal how much of your identity became connected to someone's attention. Maybe He is showing you that you were trying to earn love instead of receiving love that was freely given. Maybe He is teaching you that chasing someone cannot create emotional security. Maybe the silence is revealing that you were spending more energy trying to understand someone else's heart than listening to your own. And that realization can hurt, but pain does not always mean something has gone wrong. Sometimes pain is evidence that something hidden has finally been brought into the light. Think about what happens when everything becomes quiet at night. During the day, you can stay busy. You can work, talk, scroll, laugh, and distract yourself. But when the world becomes still, your thoughts become louder. That is where many people begin confronting what they avoided. And perhaps the same thing happens to someone who created distance from you. When the distractions fade, memories can surface. When the emotional noise disappears, questions can emerge. When there is no longer constant interaction, they may begin recognizing what the relationship actually meant. But remember this, their realization belongs to their journey. Your revelation belongs to yours. Do not turn silence into an obsession. Do not sit in darkness waiting for someone else's mind to change. Use the silence to rebuild your relationship with yourself and with your purpose. Ask deeper questions. What is this season teaching me? What do I need to release? What boundaries do I need? What patterns can I no longer carry? What kind of love do I want to experience in the future? What kind of person am I becoming? Those questions will take you somewhere, because sometimes God does not remove people from your life to make you suffer. Sometimes He creates space so that you can hear what you were too emotionally overwhelmed to hear before. And one of the greatest lessons may be this: you cannot force what God has not ordained. If someone is meant to remain in your life, you should not have to destroy your peace trying to keep them there. If someone needs to leave, you can release them without believing that your life has ended. And if a relationship was meant to teach you something, then honor the lesson. Do not waste the lesson by remaining trapped in resentment. Do not turn heartbreak into bitterness. Turn it into wisdom. Turn it into discipline. Turn it into deeper faith. Turn it into stronger boundaries. Turn it into compassion, and turn it into a commitment to never abandon yourself again. Because sometimes the greatest blessing hidden inside silence is clarity. You finally see what you could not see when you were desperate to make things work. You recognize where you were overgiving. You recognize where you were ignoring your own needs. You recognize where you were accepting confusion as love. And once you see it, you cannot unsee it. That is growth. So if life has become quiet, do not panic. Listen, there may be something important being revealed. Maybe the silence is not telling you to wait. Maybe it is telling you to wake up. Maybe it is not asking you to chase someone. Maybe it is asking you to chase your purpose. And perhaps the greatest divine lesson is this: sometimes God allows a relationship to become silent so that your soul can finally become loud enough to remind you who you are. There comes a moment when you have to stop making someone else's realization the measurement of your healing. Maybe they eventually understand what they lost. Maybe they replay the conversations, remember your presence, recognize the effort you gave, and finally understand that you were more valuable than they allowed themselves to admit. But hear this clearly: their realization is not your destination. Your transformation is. You cannot build your future around the possibility that someone will someday look back and finally appreciate you. That keeps your heart tied to the past. It keeps your energy focused on a person who may not even be participating in your present. And life is too valuable to spend waiting for someone else's emotional awakening. Maybe you have been asking, when will they miss me? Ask a better question. When will I stop missing the version of myself that I became while trying to keep them? Because sometimes what you really miss is not the person. You miss who you were when you believed the relationship could become everything you hoped for. You miss the future you imagined. You miss the possibility. But possibility is not the same as reality. And your life cannot be built on potential alone. There is a divine principle here. What is taken away can create room for what is meant to grow. The closed door may have broken your heart, but it may also have opened a path toward deeper self-respect. The silence may have hurt, but it may have taught you to listen to yourself. The rejection may have wounded you, but it may have forced you to discover that your worth cannot be negotiated. This is where transformation begins. You stop trying to become worthy of someone else's love. You start becoming worthy of your own respect. You stop chasing explanations. You start creating direction. You stop monitoring their behavior. You start managing your own energy. You stop asking whether they are watching you move on. You start actually moving on. Not as a performance, not to make them jealous, not to make them regret their decision, but because your life deserves movement. You have goals waiting for you. You have abilities waiting to be developed. You have opportunities waiting for your courage. You have people you have not met yet. You have experiences you have not lived yet. You have a future that cannot be built while you remain emotionally parked in yesterday. And perhaps the most powerful thing you can do is become so deeply committed to your growth that their realization becomes irrelevant. Imagine waking up one morning and realizing you no longer need to know whether they miss you. You no longer need to know whether they regret leaving. You no longer need to know whether they are replaying the relationship. You simply know who you are. That is freedom. Because when your confidence comes from within, another person's attention becomes a gift rather than a requirement. You can appreciate love without begging for it. You can remember someone without returning to them. You can forgive without reopening the door. You can wish someone well without waiting for them. And you can love what was without sacrificing what can be. That is maturity. So if they eventually realize your value, let them. If their mind replays everything, let it. If memories return, let them teach whatever they need to teach. But you keep walking, keep building, keep praying, keep learning, keep becoming, because the greatest proof that you healed is not that they came back. It is that you stopped needing them to. And perhaps one day you will look at the entire experience differently. You will realize that the relationship did not simply take something from you. It gave you lessons that changed you. It taught you boundaries. It taught you patience. It taught you discernment. It taught you what you will and will not accept. It taught you that love without consistency is not enough. It taught you that emotional connection without emotional courage cannot create lasting peace. And most importantly, it taught you to come home to yourself, so do not wait for someone else's awakening, have your own. Do not wait for them to recognize your worth, recognize it yourself. Do not wait for them to choose you, choose yourself, because when you finally do, you become unstoppable, not because you stopped caring, but because you learned that caring for someone else should never require abandoning yourself. Your transformation is the victory. Your peace is the victory. Your purpose is the victory. And the moment you understand that, their realization becomes secondary. You no longer need them to replay everything. You are too busy creating something they cannot take away. A life that is finally aligned with who you were meant to become.